Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Thompson, and I'm the CEO and Medical Director of Mind Matters Clinic, and this is another episode of the Mind series. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about the problems that adults face who have ADHD when they're trying to parent their children with ADHD, or even without it. So the struggle that many people will have as adults as they try to parent their children can be something that magnifies when they have children with ADHD. And I'm going to explain about what adult ADHD is and how it impacts parenting. Adult ADHD is a common disorder. Many children who have ADHD carry it on into adulthood. Between 50 and 65% of children who have ADD as children continue to carry it into their lives as adults. So the percentage of adults with ADHD is about 4.4% in the United States. The problem is that a lot of times in the past, people believed that ADHD was something that would go away in teenage years, but now we've found that there are a lot of adults who continue to carry the problems that they had as children with ADHD into their adult lives. Recognition of it is, I think, is sometimes the hardest part. A lot of adults with ADHD don't know that they have it, and hence they continue to struggle and not know why they struggle. Many adults with ADHD show signs and symptoms which are different than when they were children. So sometimes it's not as easily recognized, and as is true in children, adults with ADHD oftentimes have many other things going on besides ADHD. They may have other concerns or medical conditions which then change the way that adult ADHD looks. Adult ADHD has the same three basic things that you see in children, and usually it's a mix of all three. There's something called adult combined type ADHD, which means they have all three parts of ADHD, and then there's some who may just have one part of that. The three parts of ADHD, as is true in children, are inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Inattention in adults is something that you would recognize in adults as trouble with listening, meaning if you are talking to them and giving them instructions or explaining something, they may not catch all of what you're talking about because they're not entirely tuned into what you're saying. So they may miss pieces. And so that can be manifested in something like in a job or a workplace or in parenting or in conversations on the phone where they don't really catch all that's being said. And hence they oftentimes will respond in a way which is not always appropriate because they haven't heard it all. People with inattentive type, the inattention part of it also often have difficulty with being organized. So say they're trying to accomplish tasks in the home, they become easily disorganized, they have piles of things that are around the house that they haven't completed. An example being paying attention to something, meaning you're able to continue it on to being complete. Adults with ADHD oftentimes will become distracted easily and head from one activity to another. An example being, say I know that I have to do the laundry. And so I head into the laundry room with a stack of laundry, and once I get in the laundry room, I notice that there's a nut or a bolt that's sitting there, and I remember that nut and bolt is something that was missing from something that's another part of the house. And so I set down the laundry, I pick up the nut or the bolt, and I head into the living room to repair the thing that needs to be repaired with the nut or the bolt. Once I get in the living room, I notice that there's something on the floor there that really needs to be fixed too. And so then I head off to find something else to fix the thing that's wrong with the floor. And this can go on as you head around the house and you start one project and you drop it once you notice something else, and then you forget all about the fact that you're going to be doing laundry. So oftentimes you'll see adults who kind of move around the house doing things and then not completing the first thing that they set out to do. Or they'll forget that they were about to do something. Eventually they may get back to it, but they sometimes have that difficulty in starting something and then following it all the way through to be complete in a timely way. Adults oftentimes also feel overwhelmed with the tasks of living. Say they have a big project to do. They become overwhelmed in knowing how to start the project, how to finish the project, how to prioritize the project with other things that are going on. And so sometimes they just sit back and feel overwhelmed because they know there's just too much for them to think about. And so sometimes they get lost just in the process of getting prepared for whatever it is they're trying to do. Adults with ADHD, again, because of their inattention, sometimes forget things like appointments or deadlines. An example being in a doctor's office. Oftentimes we'll have adults who come in for their appointments and they'll show up a half hour late. They might come in the wrong day. They may show up in the afternoon rather than the morning. They may forget altogether and forget to call. We're kind of used to that, but it can be more distressing in other offices that aren't used to working with adults with ADHD. In the workplace, the same kind of thing can happen where they have a deadline to meet and they forget all about the deadline. The boss says, I want you to do this by Tuesday. Tuesday comes and goes and they've forgotten all about it. So then they have to race to catch up to do it in a late manner, which obviously then impacts their ability to function at work. They tend to be disorganized, and so if you look at their workspace or if you look at their house or their desk, something like that, you'll see things scattered about the desk, piles here, piles there. Sometimes adults with ADHD can recognize that they have these piles, but they have their own way of saying, well, I know this pile has all my bills. This pile over here are things I might get to later. This pile over here is something I think somebody else needs. And this pile over here means projects I really haven't finished. And they may go from pile to pile to pile, but not complete the things they need to complete. In conversations, sometimes adults with ADHD have this inability to really listen to a conversation all the way through. They get oftentimes accused of not listening, which obviously can be a problem with a spouse or with an employer or something like that. What oftentimes they'll do is they'll start to listen to what you're saying, and then either they say something that reminds the person of something else they want to think about, and so they become distracted and start thinking about that. Or what is also common is that they try to guess where you're going with what you're saying, and so they will, in their own mind, will finish the conversation by saying, oh, I know what they're going to say, and so they finish it in their own head and don't listen to the second half of what the other person's saying. And they may get it right. They may know where the person's heading with it, but sometimes they don't. And so again, they may miss a piece of what's being said. In relationships, oftentimes it's a problem because if there's a spouse that's talking to their husband or wife who has ADD, they expect to have their full attention. And if they notice that the person is not listening or is misperceiving what they're saying because they're not paying attention, then they become insulted. They think that the person with adult ADHD doesn't care about them because obviously they're not listening, hence they don't care about what I'm saying, which obviously isn't the case because adults with ADHD really have that difficulty in really dialing in on conversation and understanding what somebody's trying to say. But it's seen as being insulting, as being rude, and that sort of a thing, so then the spouse oftentimes becomes upset. They have a poor time sense. This is a really common thing. Most of us, when we set about to do a project or see our day laid out ahead of us, kind of have a sense of how time is passing. We have this internal clock in our head that tells us, okay, I've been sitting here, for example, I could guess that I've been sitting here now for 5 minutes. And I can estimate that I have 25 minutes left and that I need to finish what I'm doing within that 25 minutes. Adults with ADHD don't really have a good grasp oftentimes of feeling the time passing. They will estimate that they've been doing something for 5 minutes when they've really been doing it for 30 minutes. Or they think that, okay, I can finish that project by the end of the day if I start later. Well, later can be much later. So if it's a 4-hour project, they may wait until there's not 4 hours left in the day, and then they start too late, and then they can't complete the project. So they don't really have that internal clock that tells them what they need to be doing. So again, it looks like they are unmotivated, or that they don't care about the project they're trying to complete because they don't start it in a timely way. So again, if a boss or a spouse says, for example, the spouse says, I'd really like to have you wash the car today. And the person with ADHD says, I got it, I do it, and they intend to do it. They intend to complete the project. They want to do what their spouse has asked them to do, but that internal time clock prevents them from starting in a timely way. The spouse who's observing that will say, oh gosh, here it comes again. They're not going to start in time. They're not going to finish the project. They haven't even started moving towards doing the project. So since they're not moving towards finishing the project, again, they believe then that the spouse really doesn't care about completing the project. And lo and behold, oftentimes then, it's gotten dark, the car still isn't washed, and the person with ADHD goes, oh man, it's too late. Oh, okay, well, I'll do it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow can be the next day, and it can be the next day, and you can carry forward like that. So that's kind of the inattentive part of ADHD. And just a note, sometimes people wonder, okay, how do you decide if somebody with adult ADHD actually has ADHD? How do they know that they have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? How is it different from a normal individual? Adults with ADHD, a normal person might sometimes forget to do something. They may delay in doing something, but that would be an occurrence that happens now and then. With an adult with ADHD, it's something that really kind of describes them, that you could predict that it's going to be frequently something that impairs their ability to perform, their ability to accomplish things. So spouses and coworkers will oftentimes recognize that that's a pattern of a behavior. It's not something that happens now and then. It won't happen just in certain situations. It's basically going to happen most of the time because that's the way their brain is wired. And so anytime you talk about an adult with this condition, it shouldn't be something that just happens now and then. It really should be something you can look back on their entire life into childhood and see that you see the same pattern of behavior that carries forward. The second part of ADHD that you see is called impulsivity. Impulsivity is the inability to hold back or refrain from doing something that you shouldn't do, and then just do it without considering the consequence. An example would be emotional outbursts or saying something you shouldn't say to somebody. I think all of us have had the experience that if we're in a conversation with somebody or we notice something about someone or I'm upset with somebody. Being a married man, I know sometimes that there's something that my wife might say that I don't agree with, but then I have to consider it. I have to send it up to the front part of my brain, and my brain says, you know, you may disagree with it, but it's probably not something you should bring up right now. Or it may be something that's not a big deal and you just let it slide. Sometimes it's best not to say anything. An adult with ADHD who is impulsive will say whatever on their mind and then go, oops, shouldn't have said that. And so then sometimes they recoil and back up, and then they have to go through the process of apologizing, wishing they hadn't said what they had just said. So it's that impulsive speech. Same thing with an emotional urge. I have the emotion to become angry. I have the urge to feel sad and cry. I have the urge to laugh at something that somebody else just did, which may be funny, but if you were to laugh right now, it would probably make that person feel bad. But can I then not respond to that urge to laugh? Because we all get it's sometimes funny to see somebody make a mistake, and then do you laugh? You know, it's not necessarily the appropriate thing to do to laugh. So can you restrain or refrain from doing what you have the urge to do? Adults with ADHD oftentimes make impulsive mistakes with driving. So adults with ADHD have a 5-fold or 5 times the number of speeding tickets, of accidents, and you can again kind of see that if you're driving along and you say, I see a yellow light there, I think I can make it through. If you're don't have ADHD, you may think it through and say, yeah, I might be able to make it through, but maybe I shouldn't do it. And so you put on the brakes and you stop. Just like that, with an adult with ADHD, boom, you've headed off through the intersection. Did you anticipate it right? Did you judge it right? Did you go through and it turned red and you end up getting a ticket? So typically they oftentimes have more difficulty with driving offenses that way. Same thing if they're driving along and you notice something that's on the seat next to you, or there's something that's on the radio that you want to mess with, or you notice there's something stuck to your shoe while you're driving. Do you reach down and grab that thing that's stuck to your shoe, or do you say, maybe I shouldn't do that because I'm driving? So maybe I should say, wait till I stop, and then I can check the thing that's on my shoe. And again, an adult with ADHD may reach down, grab what's on their shoe, they look up, and now they're in trouble. So those are the kind of things you see with driving. Job changes. Adults with ADHD oftentimes feel somewhat restless in their job to begin with. They may say things to their boss that offend them. They may find that things that they're doing that they don't enjoy, they will say it. The boss asks them to do a job which they don't like to do, and they may just say it. And then if the boss reacts negatively to them, again, there's kind of this emotional response. They say, well, forget it. I don't want the job. I'm gone. I'm leaving. And so oftentimes they'll just quit their job without any idea of what they're going to do after that or what the consequences of that are. So obviously if that person does that and they walk out on a job, the employer is not going to say, oh, I understand you have ADHD, hence I'm going to say, okay, what you just said you didn't mean, come on back, you can come back to work. So oftentimes they will change a job frequently. So adults with ADHD oftentimes, if you look at their history, they may have had several jobs along the way. And the reasons for quitting that job are sometimes kind of vague or based on a single emotional moment that happened in the job. They tend to interrupt others. That's that impulsive part. You have somebody that's talking and you jump in and you say something. You offend others when you do that. You interrupt others when you're trying to talk on the phone. You won't let them finish talking, saying what they want to say because you're so anxious to say something. Adults with ADHD oftentimes have trouble, if they have a thought, it comes out. It's not something that they can say, oh, hold your thought. It might be a better time for me to say this later. So they tend to be very spontaneous in their speech, which can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing too. Spending habits are sometimes a problem with adult ADHD also. If I walk into a store and I look at some really cool computer gadget that I like, and I look at it and I say, wow, I really like that. I think I want to buy it. I have 3 more at home, but I think I'll buy it anyway. And so they grab it off the shelf, they buy it, they get out to their car, and sometimes they'll look at it and say, wow, why did I buy that? I already have 3 more at home. So they start stacking up things at home. They start overspending. They spend beyond their budget. A budget is something that we would all use by saying, okay, is this something I can afford to do right now? If not, then I better delay the expense. I shouldn't go buy that sort of a thing. But that requires that ability to sort through it, to not act impulsively, to sift through what you might want to do with what you should do. And again, that's the difficulty that people with adult ADHD have when they're impulsive like that. They oftentimes will gravitate towards alcohol and drugs. And again, sometimes that's a matter of saying, gee, I'd really like to have a glass of wine tonight. By the way, there's a PTA meeting at 7 o'clock, and it's 6 o'clock right now, and they decide, I'm going to have a glass of wine. It sounds good. Under normal circumstances, maybe fine to have a glass of wine, but it may also be something you stop and you think and you say, I'm about to go to a parent-teacher conference. I don't know if I should go there and have alcohol in my breath or look at the least bit inebriated when I get there. So maybe I should wait till after the parent-teacher conference to have that glass of wine. So that would be the normal ability of what I call the coach, which is the front part of the brain coaching you, saying, gee, this is a good idea or this is a bad idea. So do you take time to listen to the coach, or do you just have that glass of wine? Next thing you know, you're at the parent-teacher conference, alcohol in your breath. The teacher looks at you and says, oh gosh, look at that. The parent comes here drinking. I can't believe it. What an unreliable parent that must be at home. So they start to make a judgment about that person. Hyperactive. Adults with hyperactivity look different than children with hyperactivity. We all can kind of picture the child who has hyperactivity, who's the one who's squirming in the seat, he's up and out of his seat, moving around, he's dropping things off the table, flipping pencils around, that sort of a thing. Adults with ADHD sometimes carry some of those traits. They may fidget. A lot of them actually doodle. That means writing or making the designs on paper while they're listening. Actually, research has shown that doodling can help them focus, meaning they're actually listening to what's going on while they're doodling, and they can still pay attention while they're doing it. But sometimes to the observer, they look at the person who's doodling, and they're saying, they're not listening, they're not paying attention. Well, sometimes that's just the manifestation of their hyperactivity. Adults with ADHD who have hyperactive symptoms oftentimes feel very restless internally. They feel that need to want to get up and move around. They feel the need to change what they're doing to do something differently. And so sometimes what that does is it creates a certain amount of irritability. If they're constrained and they have to sit there for the meeting, they have to sit there to finish listening to the conversation, they have to finish doing what they're doing because they're forced to, and they feel that need to move around, they become irritable. I really don't want to sit here. This is making me feel really uncomfortable. And so sometimes their emotional part will come out as being irritable. And so that's the most common symptom you'll find in adults with ADHD who have that hyperactive part, is they seem irritable. Another thing that causes irritability in adults is oftentimes adults with ADHD, they have a lot of things going on in their head. There's something called working memory, which is the ability to take thoughts and ideas and you put them together, and then you set this aside, and you say, okay, I want to focus on this piece over here, and I'm going to ignore this piece over here. I'm going to try not to become distracted by that thing over there. Adults with ADHD have that trouble of sorting those things and putting things aside. So oftentimes they have several things going on in their head all at once, and they're trying to do something with it. And then you, as the person who comes into their sphere, into their world right there, like a spouse, I am busy doing this project, and my wife comes in and says, oh, by the way, hon, could you go out and wash the car? And now for an adult with ADHD, he's already got all these things going on in his head, and for the spouse to ask him to wash the car, it's like, oh, don't do that. I've got enough in my head right now, don't add something to it. And so then they may kind of lash out a bit saying, don't do that. And for the person observing, they don't get it. They don't understand that that person has all these things going on in their head, and it's really a struggle for them to consider something, another thing. I liken it sometimes to juggling tennis balls. And so you have 6 balls you're trying to juggle, and what you should do is take at least 3 of those and set them over here and say, okay, I will take care of those things later. I will address that at a later point. But for them, they're still juggling 6 balls, and so you as a spouse, you come in and you throw another tennis ball in there, which is another thought or something else that they need to consider, and all of a sudden they got another ball. And they're going, look, I already got 6, I can't handle 7. So it can be kind of overwhelming for them to do that. Yet they have difficulty expressing that to a spouse, so oftentimes they just look like they're being unnecessarily irritable, angry, reactive that way. They can fidget, they can roll things around their hands, they can need to move around a lot. Some adults with ADHD will oftentimes find jobs or vocations or activities which allow them to move around. I have an adult patient who sells used cars. He does very well, but he has to keep moving. So he does very well in that he can walk around the lot, he can continue to address needs of other people, but he has to be very careful that once it comes time to make the sale, that he hands it off to the manager of the used car lot so he can take care of all the details, because he knows for himself that if he has to sit down and do all the work here, he won't do as well. So for him, he's found a way which works for him that he can be kind of hyperactive and movement and that sort of a thing, but it works for him. Sometimes talking too much is a form of hyperactivity. So adults with ADHD oftentimes will just talk excessively. They're a motor mouth. They will just continue to talk even though the person that they're talking to may have lost interest. Because they're not necessarily paying attention, they won't notice that the person has lost interest. We all show signs to other people once we have lost interest. We start to put our arms up back like that. We tend to look away. We start to walk away. An adult with ADHD may just continue to talk and not notice those signs or cues from other people when they occur. If that happens again, people will say, well, they're not letting me talk. They're talking too much. So once again, the perception is that the adult with ADHD must not care about what you're thinking or feeling if they continue to talk at that excessive amount. The potential advantages of adults with ADHD, which is not always negative, adults with ADHD have this incredible ability to think outside the box. So say I don't have ADHD, and say I have a project I want to accomplish. I may look at it kind of in a cut and dried sort of a way. I may look at it in a traditional way of saying, okay, this is the way I should do the project. Whereas an adult with ADHD may look at it from an entirely different perspective and say, gosh, why don't we just do it this way? It would be completely out of the box kind of thinking, and it can be very refreshing. Sometimes they can problem solve where people without ADD can't problem solve that way because they haven't even considered that different kind of perspective. They tend to be very spontaneous, so they can be very fun because, again, they just kind of roll with what they're saying, what they're thinking, and things come out of their mouth that can be really entertaining and fun. And so people can be very entertaining to be around when they have adults with ADHD. They can be very enthusiastic because, again, many adults without ADHD may be constrained by, oh, I better not show too much enthusiasm here, or may not be too excited about this because people might think this or might think that or something like that. Whereas an adult with ADD says, oh, just go for it. I think this is exciting. This is something I want to do. And so they can generate a lot of enthusiasm in a group. So the trick is, how do they do that, accomplish what they want to do because of their organizational limitations? So again, sometimes they need to find ways to use the gifts or the benefits that they have in a way which is going to be helpful. And in part two of what we're going to talk about tonight, it will be talking about, okay, what are some of the ways an adult with ADHD can accomplish those things without having the problems of the ADHD. Some of the consequences that you see with adults with ADHD is that they themselves may have struggled in school. They may have had struggles with finances, both because of impulsive spending and because sometimes they have trouble with organizing their finances, paying their bills on time, that sort of a thing. They oftentimes have trouble with their relationships, like we talked about. If you have a spouse and you're talking to the spouse and they don't think you're listening, then that's going to impact your relationship with the spouse. So all those things start to factor in, and then obviously that will all impact their parenting, their ability to effectively parent their child. They need to organize their child's life, and they need to organize their own life. And so if they're having trouble organizing their own life and accomplishing they need to accomplish, then how do they do that with their child? So that is sometimes the dilemma. How do we use their gifts and not limit it by the way that they parent their children? So in part two, we'll talk about that. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in part two.